The dust was a living thing, a malevolent spirit of the plains that clawed its way through the cracks of Redemption's buildings. It turned the noon sun into a bruised, jaundiced eye and scraped the throat raw with every breath. Inside the First Redemption Bank, the air was thick with the scent of stale paper and desperation. Jonah Briggs stood before the teller's cage, his hat held tight in his hands, the sweat-stained brim twisted into a knot. His reflection in the polished brass grill was that of a stranger, a hollowed-out man with eyes the color of a faded sky and a beard threaded with premature gray. "I understand the drought's been hard on everyone," Mr. Abernathy. Jonah's voice was a low rasp, worn thin by dust and disuse. "But the well on my land is deep. It's the only one for miles that hasn't run dry. A small loan, just enough for feed to get the last of my herd through the season. I can pay it back. I swear it." Mr. Abernathy, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced by a measuring stick, peered over his spectacles. "Good intentions don't fill the bank's coffers, Jonah. Your ranch is already mortgaged to the hilt. You have no collateral." Jonah's shoulders sagged. He had known this was the final, desperate roll of the dice. He slowly, reverently reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a small silver locket tarnished with age, but intricately carved with forget-me-nots. He laid it on the polished mahogany counter, the metal cool against the warm wood. The gentle click it made seemed to echo in the oppressive silence of the bank. "This was my wife's," he said, his voice catching. "It's all I have left of them. Sterling silver. It's worth something." Abernathy picked it up with two delicate fingers, as if handling something unclean. He squinted at it, his expression a mixture of pity and professional disinterest. Sentiment is not a currency the bank recognizes. Before he could say more, the bank's heavy oak doors burst open with a violent crack, slamming against the interior wall. The dust storm outside seemed to pour into the room, and silhouetted within it were four figures. The man in the lead strode forward with the arrogant swagger of someone who owned every piece of ground he stepped on. He wore the tattered remnants of a Union sergeant's uniform. The blue fabric faded to a ghostly gray, but the authority in his bearing was undiminished. His face was sharp, intelligent, and marked by a cruel twist to his lips. This was Sergeant Merrick. "Apologies for the intrusion, gentlemen." Merrick's voice was smooth-cultured, a jarring contrast to his ragged appearance. "We're here to make a withdrawal." His men, a trio of hard-faced marauders, fanned out, their pistols drawn. The few customers in the bank froze, hands slowly rising. A woman stifled a scream. Jonah's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Merrick's cold gray eyes swept the room and landed on the counter. He walked over his spurs, ringing a death knell on the floorboards. He ignored the trembling Abernathy and looked down at the locket. "What have we here?" He picked it up, his grimy thumb smearing the silver. "A trinket." "Please," Jonah heard himself say the word, a weak plea. "It's my wife's." Merrick's eyes flicked to Jonah, a flicker of amusement in their depths. He clicked the locket open. Inside, the tiny hand-painted portraits of a smiling woman and two small children stared out. A family man, Merrick sneered the sound like grinding stones. Or at least you were. He snapped the locket shut and slipped it into his own pocket. A reminder that sentiment is a weakness. Consider this a lesson. The robbery was brutally efficient. Merrick's men emptied the tills, and the safe moving with a practiced military precision. Within minutes, they were gone, melting back into the swirling brown chaos of the storm, leaving behind a terrified silence and the lingering smell of gunpowder. Jonah stood motionless, his hand outstretched over the empty space on the counter where the locket had been. The money didn't matter. The loan didn't matter. Merrick had taken more than silver. He had stolen the last ghost of a memory. the last tangible piece of a life that had been burned to ash. The long ride back to his ranch was a journey through purgatory. The wind howled, flinging grit against his face, but Jonah felt nothing. He was already hollow. His ranch sat in a small, desolate valley, a collection of weathered buildings crouched against the unforgiving landscape. The sun bleached the land to the color of bone, and the wind carried a constant whisper of dust that settled in the lines of a man's face. This place had once been a haven, a dream built with his own 2 hands and the boundless love of his wife Sarah. Now it was a tomb. He dismounted the creak of saddle leather, a lonely sound in the vast silence. His gaze fell upon the charred patch of earth where his home had once stood. A single blackened stone chimney pointed toward the sky like an accusing finger. 3 years. 3 years since the fire. He had been in town buying supplies, delayed by a lame horse. He returned to an inferno, a nightmare of orange and black against the night sky. The official report called it a renegade Apache raid, a random act of savagery. But Jonah knew better. He had found a shell casing near the foundation, an Army-issue .44 caliber with a unique scratch on its base. It wasn't Apache. It was calculated. It was murder. He had failed them. He wasn't there to protect them. The guilt was a physical weight, a shroud he wore every waking moment. The silver locket had been his penance, a constant gleaming reminder of that failure. Now even that was gone. He walked to the 3 small mounds of earth under a solitary wind-twisted oak tree. He didn't have the words to tell them he had failed again. Defeated, he turned toward the barn and the last standing structure of any size. He had nothing left. No future, no hope, just the bitter taste of dust and the echoing silence of his own broken heart. It was then, as he neared the sagging fence line that bordered his property, that he saw them. 4 shapes impossibly large collapsed in the mud, left by a brief passing shower that had done little more than turn the dust to sludge. At first, his tired mind registered them as fallen logs debris from the storm. But then an arm moved a hand, clenching weakly in the mud. His breath caught in his throat. They weren't logs. They were people. Women. Their frames were immense, their limbs thick as oak branches, their shoulders wider than his cabin door. Even lying in the dirt, ravaged by exhaustion, they possessed a formidable statuesque power. He moved closer, his boots sinking into the wet earth. They were Apache. Iron shackles, broken and twisted, were still locked around their wrists, the raw bloody wounds beneath a testament to their escape. Scorch marks marred their buckskin garments, and their faces were masks of cracked lips and sunken eyes. They looked as though they had clawed their way out of hell itself. Jonah's first instinct was a cold, sharp spike of fear and self-preservation. Helping an Apache, especially an escaped prisoner, was a death sentence. He could already picture the gallows in Redemption's town square, could feel the phantom burn of the rope around his neck. He had seen a farmer hang for giving a crust of bread to a starving native child. The frontier offered no mercy for such transgressions. He turned to walk away, to retreat into the shell of his own misery and pretend he had seen nothing. But then, the smallest of the 4, a woman who still towered over him, stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, dark pools of exhaustion and pain. Her cracked lips parted, and a sound less a word than a desperate exhalation of air escaped. "Water?" The whisper was ragged faint, but it cut through the wind and straight into the core of Jonah Briggs. He froze, his hand clenching and unclenching at his side. In that sound, he didn't hear an enemy. He didn't hear an Apache. He heard a human being begging for life. It was the same sound of hopeless desperation he had carried inside himself for 3 years. He looked from the exhausted women to the charred remains of his home, to the graves of his family. He had lost everything to violence and hatred. What was left of a man if he too turned his back on a soul in need? In that moment, standing between the ghosts of his past and the dying women at his feet, Jonah realized the unforgiving West wasn't just a test of a man's strength, but of his very soul. And his was hanging precariously in the balance. His hand tightened around the handle of the wooden bucket hanging by the well. The rope groaned in protest as he lowered it into the depths, the splash of water echoing the turmoil in his heart. Each turn of the crank was a deliberate choice, a step away from the safety of indifference, and onto a path from which there could be no return. He knelt in the mud beside the woman who had spoken her name. He would later learn was Kiona. He lifted the bucket, tilting it carefully, letting a small stream of cool, clear water trickle onto her lips. She drank greedily, her throat working life, seeping back into her with every swallow. One by one he moved to the others, offering them the same life-giving gift. The eldest, whose calm and authoritative presence was palpable even in her prostrate state, met his eyes with a gaze that held no fear, only a profound, weary understanding. The one beside her, whose muscular frame spoke of a warrior's life, drank without a word, her gratitude conveyed through a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The last woman, whose eyes were distant and observant, as if she were seeing something beyond the muddy ground and gray sky, accepted the water with a quiet grace. As he helped Kiona sit up, her hand, as large as a dinner plate, closed around his wrist. The strength in her grip was startling, a sudden reminder of the power latent in these women. A cold knot tightened in his gut, but her eyes held no menace, only a desperate, gnawing hunger. Food, she rasped the word, a raw plea. Jonah looked toward his small, dilapidated cabin. Inside, on a rough-hewn table, sat his entire provision for the day, a single small loaf of dry, crusty bread, no bigger than his hand. It was all he had. The loan denied, his stores depleted. This was the last barrier between him and starvation. Yet, as he looked into the 4 pairs of eyes fixed upon him, he knew the bread was no longer his. He gave a weary, grim smile. Some choices once made all the others for you. Inside the cabin, he broke the loaf into 4 pieces. The act felt momentous, a sacrament performed in the dim, dusty light. He returned to the women and placed a piece into each of their waiting hands. Their enormous fingers, calloused and scarred, quivered as they took the bread, eating slowly, deliberately, as if trying to savor a miracle. Jonah leaned back against a fence post, the wood groaning under his weight, and watched them. He had just wagered his life on a bucket of water and a scrap of bread. His memory, unbidden, drifted back to that night of fire and screams. The men who had destroyed his life had done so in the name of order, of progress, of law. They had hidden their cruelty behind a uniform and a mandate. Looking at the women before him, he saw not criminals, but victims of that same brutal logic. The scars on their wrists were not the marks of justice, but of tyranny. In their defiance, he saw a reflection of the helpless rage that had consumed him for 3 years. Perhaps this path led to the gallows, but it was a path he was no longer walking alone. The cruelty of the frontier had taken everything from him. He would not allow it to take his humanity as well. With immense effort, Jonah helped them one by one into the old, abandoned cattle barn. The structure smelled of decay and damp earth, a ghost of its former purpose. The rotted wooden door creaked shut, plunging the interior into a dim twilight, pierced by slivers of light, lancing through cracks in the walls. The 4 women filled the space, their towering bodies making Jonah feel like a child lost among ancient living statues. He draped a single tattered blanket over Kiona's shivering shoulders, the only comfort he could offer. He then slumped to the dirt floor, his back against a support beam, the rifle he always carried, now resting across his lap. The silence was thick with unspoken questions. He had acted on instinct, on a flicker of a moral compass he thought long broken. Now, in the quiet aftermath, the enormity of his decision settled upon him. The eldest woman broke the silence. Her voice, though raspy from thirst, was steady and firm, accustomed to command. "I am Nala. These are my sisters." "Taya," she gestured to the powerful warrior. "Suri," she indicated the quiet, observant one. "And Kiona." "Jonah Briggs," he replied, his voice flat. "We are not common prisoners." Jonah Briggs Nala continued her English, measured and proficient. "We were taken because we defied an order." "What order?" Jonah asked, his eyes narrowing. Nala's gaze was unflinching. "A man in a soldier's uniform, though he leads only renegades, now came to our village. He said the land was to be cleared. He ordered his men to set fire to the lodges, to everything. The women, the children, all of them." The air in the barn grew cold and heavy. Jonah felt a familiar sharp pain in his chest, as if an old wound had been torn open. The image of his own home, a pyre against the night, flashed behind his eyes. The phantom screams of Sarah and his children echoed in his ears. He knew this story. He had lived its brutal conclusion. Kiona, the youngest, spat on the dirt floor. Her eyes, even in the dim light, glowed with a fiery indignation. "They wanted to make an example of us. We stood in their way. Taya disarmed 2 of them before they overwhelmed us. For that they bound us in chains and called us traitors. They were taking us to be hanged in some white man's town when we broke free." She let out a rough, bitter laugh. "We ran until we could run no more and fell into your hands." Jonah said nothing. His gaze traced the deep, festering wounds on their wrists. He looked at Taya, whose knuckles were bruised and split. He saw the quiet intensity in Suri's eyes, the defiant fire in Kiona's, the unyielding dignity in Nala's. These were not criminals. They were protectors. For the first time in 3 years, the world sharpened into a terrible, simple clarity. There was the law of men like Merrick and Abernathy, a cold, cruel arithmetic of power and profit. And then there was another law, an older one, written not on paper, but in the heart. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, and he had to choose which one he would die in. He sighed a long, ragged exhalation that seemed to carry some of the weight from his soul. He took off his worn hat and set it on the ground beside him. "You're weak," he stated, the words more practical than unkind. "Rest. They'll be looking for you. I'll keep watch, at least until morning." No one spoke again. The only sounds were the mournful whistle of the wind through the cracks and the slow, heavy breathing of the 4 sisters as exhaustion finally claimed them. Jonah sat in the darkness, his rifle in his hands, his eyes wide open. He was a keeper of secrets now, a guardian of fugitives. He knew they would come, and this time he might not live to see the dawn. Afternoon bled into a bruised orange twilight. The wind picked up, carrying clouds of red dust that choked the air and painted the western sky in apocalyptic hues. Jonah was trying to mend a section of fence, the repetitive, mindless work, a small defense against the storm of thoughts in his head, when the ground began to tremble. The rhythmic pounding of hooves grew louder, closer, an approaching thunder that promised violence. He lifted his head, his body going rigid. 3 riders crested the low rise and entered his yard. They wore the stained and faded blue of federal soldiers, but their discipline was gone, replaced by a predatory slouch. Ash stains, like the memory of burned villages, blackened their coats. At their lead, astride a powerful black charger, was Sergeant Merrick. His cold gray eyes dull and lifeless, as a wolf's swept across the desolate ranch. Briggs Merrick's voice was a sharp bark cutting through the wind. He reined his horse in the animal, tossing its head and pawing at the ground. "We have reports of strange tracks in this area. Big ones. Like some kind of monster has been through here. You seen anything?" Jonah forced his hands to remain steady on the post he was holding. He made his voice sound weary, annoyed. "Only my sickly cattle, Sergeant. They're half-starved. Tear up the ground something fierce when they wander looking for grass that ain't there." One of Merrick's men dismounted, a wiry man with shifty eyes. He crouched low, examining the mud near the fence line where the sisters had collapsed. He let out a low whistle. "Not cattle, Merrick. These are human tracks, barefoot, and bigger than any man I've ever seen." The sound of the approaching horses seemed to drain the air from Jonah's lungs. He felt a cold sweat prickle his neck. Just steps away inside the dilapidated barn, the four sisters lay hidden, their lives hanging by the thread of a rotting plank door. Merrick's gaze narrowed, fixing on Jonah with a piercing intensity that felt like a physical blow. "What's in that barn, Briggs?" Jonah swallowed against a dry throat. He forced a short, dry laugh. "Nothing you'd want. Rotting straw manure and more rats than a man can count. The roof leaks. Place smells to high heaven. But if you've got a mind to check, be my guest." He hoped the picture of filth would be a deterrent. It wasn't. The wiry soldier started walking toward the barn, his hand resting on the tarnished brass latch. Jonah's world shrank to that single small movement. He could see at all the doors, swinging open, the gasp of shock, the drawn pistols, the gunfire. He saw the noose, felt its rough hemp against his skin, heard the roar of a crowd, thirsty for a traitor's death. "Stop." The word was low, quiet, but it cut through the wind with the authority of a gunshot. The soldier froze his hand, hovering over the latch. Merrick and the other man turned their heads slowly, their expressions a mixture of surprise and contempt. Jonah's grip on the heavy fence post tightener in his hand was white-knuckled. He held it not like a tool, but like a weapon. "That's my property," he said, his voice steady, now imbued with a resolve he didn't know he possessed. "No one sets foot in there without my say-so." The air crackled with tension. The three soldiers exchanged glances, a silent conversation of threat and violence passing between them. A slow, cruel sneer spread across Merrick's face. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt at Jonah's feet. "You have nerve, rancher." "I'll grant you that," Merrick said, his voice dangerously soft. "But hear me well. If we find out you're hiding those Apache giantesses, your neck will swing so high the buzzards will get dizzy. We'll be back. And when we are, I will personally level this entire pathetic excuse for a ranch to the ground." He yanked hard on the reins, wheeling his horse around so violently it reared up its hooves, slashing the air. His eyes, like chips of granite, were locked on Jonah. He held the stare for a long moment, a silent promise of destruction, before spurring his horse and galloping away, his men following close behind. The thunder of their hooves faded into the mournful sigh of the wind, leaving the yard, steeped in a cold, hollow silence. Jonah finally let out the breath he had been holding his lungs burning. Sweat streamed from his temples, plastering strands of hair to his skin. He slowly lowered the tool, his hands trembling with the receding adrenaline. He turned his head and looked toward the barn. Through a narrow crack in the boards, 4 pairs of dark eyes watched him. They had heard everything. In that silent, shared gaze, an unspoken pact was sealed. Jonah Briggs was no longer just a man hiding fugitives. He was a combatant in their war. Night fell like a shroud, swift and absolute. The faint glow of a single lantern on the porch pushed back a small circle of darkness, a tiny island of light in an ocean of black. Jonah sat on the top step, his rifle across his knees, its cold, hard steel a small comfort. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, pinned between the law of the town that would hang him and the gratitude of the 4 women hidden in his barn. A distant coyote's howl echoed across the prairie, a lonely, ominous sound. Then out of the darkness, shapes began to materialize. They moved with a ghostly silence, dark smudges against the starlit horizon that resolved into mounted figures. Apache riders. They formed a wide, silent circle around the homestead, their presence more felt than seen. No campfires burned. The only light was the faint, cold glint of moonlight on spear tips and knife blades. Jonah rose slowly, his heart a heavy drum in his chest. He did not raise his rifle, but he kept his hand firmly upon it. A voice rough and accented called out from the shadows. "White man, you have our sisters?" The barn door shuddered. Inside, Jonah could hear Kiona stir a low growl rumbling in her chest. A quiet word from Nala settled her. They had recognized the voice. Jonah took a deep breath, the dusty air scraping his lungs. "They collapsed on my land," he called back, his voice steady. "They were dying. I gave them water. I gave them bread." A tense silence descended, stretching for what felt like an eternity. Then a tall figure dismounted and stepped forward into the edge of the lantern light. He was not the chief, but his bearing was that of a leader, adorned with the feathers and beads of a war captain. "The story of my sister's escape flies on the wind." Then the warrior set his gaze sweeping over Jonah, taking in the rifle, the worn-out clothes, the defiant set of his jaw. "It is also said that the soldiers who chained them now hunt them, and they hunt anyone who would help them." Jonah remained silent. Words were useless now. All that mattered were his actions and the consequences that were now circling him in the dark. In the barn, he knew 4 pairs of eyes were watching, waiting. The Apache leader gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Our chief Nahima will come with the dawn. He is their father. He will judge you. He will decide your fate and theirs." With a gesture, the warrior melted back into the shadows. The circle of riders remained a silent, menacing wall of observers. Jonah was a prisoner on his own land, trapped between 2 looming threats. He looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky. He had survived Merrick's visit. Now he had to survive the judgment of a chief. This night would be the longest of his life. And when morning came, every choice he had made, down to a single scrap of bread, would be weighed in the balance. The witching hour came and went, marked only by the shifting of the stars. The wind changed direction, carrying a new scent on its currents, acrid, chemical, and terrifyingly familiar. Burning pine, kerosene. Jonah, who had been dozing fitfully against a porch post, was instantly awake, his senses screaming. The sound of hooves returned, not the cautious approach of the Apache, but the confident, stalking tread of predators. Flickering lights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. Torches. Jonah scrambled to his feet, his rifle coming up to his shoulder, the worn stock fitting into the familiar groove. A squad of riders, 7 or 8 of them, poured into his yard. At their head was Sergeant Merrick, his face a demonic mask in the bobbing firelight. He held an oil barrel balanced in front of him on his saddle. He bared his teeth in a grin devoid of all humor. "I told you I'd be back, Briggs," he snarled. "Did you really think I'd let a dirt farmer make a fool of me tonight? This whole rotten homestead burns. If your Apache friends are inside, they can burn with it." "This is my land, Merrick," Jonah yelled, his voice raw as he backed toward the barn door, leveling his rifle at the sergeant's chest. "You take one more step and I'll send you to hell myself." Merrick snorted with contempt and jerked his chin. 2 of his men dismounted and advanced, sloshing foul-smelling oil from their canisters onto the dry wood of the porch. A single spark would turn his world into an inferno for the second time. Suddenly a sound like a thunderclap came from within the barn. The door didn't open. It exploded outward, torn from its rusted hinges. The four sisters stepped into the firelights of their immense forms, seeming to suck the very air from the yard. They were no longer weak fugitives. Their eyes blazed with a righteous fury, their faces set like stone. Taya let out a guttural roar, seizing a heavy rotted beam from the broken doorway, and swinging it like a war club, shattering the shoulder of the nearest soldier. Kiona, moving with the impossible speed of a panther, lunged forward, snatched a torch from a man's hand, and slammed it into the dirt, extinguishing the flame with a hiss. The night erupted into chaos. Gunfire cracked sharp and deafening. Jonah braced himself, aimed, and fired. The soldier about to toss oil onto the barn roof crumpled to the ground. The rifle's kick jolted his shoulder, but his hands were steady. There was no fear, only a cold, burning purpose. There was no turning back. The yard became a maelstrom of violence. Soldiers shouted curses, horses screamed and reared in panic. The firelight cast the sisters as giant, avenging spirits, their shadows dancing and warring across the battlefield. Suri, the quiet one, moved with a deadly grace, a long knife appearing in her hand, as if from nowhere, felling a man with a single fluid sweep. Nala stood at the center of the fray, not fighting but commanding, her powerful voice thundering orders in Apache, a rallying cry that seemed to set the very air ablaze. Jonah fired and reloaded the mechanical actions, automatic sweat and smoke stinging his eyes. For a dizzying moment, the absurdity of it all struck him. He, Jonah Briggs, a broken rancher, was standing shoulder to shoulder with four Apache warrior women holding off a renegade army under a blood-red sky. Then a new sound rose above the din of battle. The thunder of more hooves, hundreds of them, a rolling earthquake approaching from the hills. Just as it seemed they would be overwhelmed, the piercing call of Apache war horns echoed from the darkness. Torches flared to life on the surrounding ridges, revealing lines of mounted warriors sweeping in from both flanks like a tidal wave. Chief Nahima's people had arrived. Panic ripped through Merrick's men. Their attack dissolved into a frantic, chaotic retreat. Merrick, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury, snarled a final vow. "This isn't over, Briggs. At dawn, death will find you." He wrenched his horse around and fled into the night, leaving a handful of his wounded and defeated men behind. As the last hoofbeats faded, an unnerving quiet fell over the yard. It was thick with the stench of blood, gunpowder, and burning oil. Jonah slowly lowered his rifle, a tremor finally running through his exhausted arms. The four sisters stood with him, their chests heaving, their bodies bruised and bloodied but unbroken. They were Titans, guardian spirits, risen from the dust and darkness to stand at his side. The Apache warriors now filled the yard, and their torches casting a solemn, flickering light on the aftermath. The battle was over. The judgment was about to begin. Dawn broke, spilling a pale silver light over the wounded land. The homestead was a ruin of scorched earth and splintered wood, a testament to the night's fury. Jonah stood on what was left of his porch, his face gaunt, his hands still trembling slightly. Beside him, the four sisters stood in a line, no longer prisoners, but vindicated warriors. Their father, Chief Nahima, dismounted and walked into the center of the yard. His back was as straight as a lodgepole pine, his silver-streaked hair stirring in the breeze, his eyes deep and piercing. His warriors formed a silent circle, their lances held high. Nahayama's gaze swept over the scene, the bound and groaning forms of Merrick's captured men, the scorch marks, the blood in the dirt. Finally, his eyes came to rest on Jonah. "White man." And the chief's voice was low, but carried with an undeniable authority. "The law of your people is clear. Any who shelter an Apache prisoner shall hang." Jonah swallowed hard against the lump of fear in his throat, but he met the chief's gaze and stood his ground. "I know the law." Nala, the eldest, took a painful step forward. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but her voice was strong. "Father," she said, her tone thick with emotion, "this man did not shelter prisoners. He gave aid to the dying. He gave us his last piece of bread. Without him, we would have perished in the mud." Kiona stepped forward as well. "He stood with us against the soldiers. He fought as a warrior." For a long moment, Nahima was silent, his stoic face unreadable. He walked closer to Jonah, his eyes searching, weighing, judging. Jonah's heart pounded against his ribs. He braced himself for the sentence, for the signal that would end his life. Instead, the chief raised his hand, palm open, a sign of peace. His voice rang out across the silent yard. "This man is no enemy." He turned to face his warriors. "This man, Jonah Briggs, gave the last of what he had to those who stood against tyranny. From this day forward, he is an ally to our people. He shall be known as Nantan Dalke, the keeper of the oath. The law of our nation will be his shield." The words had scarcely settled when one of the warriors let out a powerful cry, a cry that was picked up by the others until the entire valley echoed with their approval. Jonah stood stunned, the sound washing over him. He, a poor, lonely rancher, an outcast from his own world, had been given a new name and a place of honor in another. Merrick, bound tightly with rope, writhed on the ground. "Indian law is nothing." He spat, his eyes wild with hatred. "He's a traitor to his own kind. He'll hang." Nahima turned, his eyes flashing with cold steel. "Your soldiers came to burn women and children. My daughters stood against them. This man stood with my daughters. Tell me, soldier, who is the traitor here?" The chief looked back at Jonah, a flicker of something new in his eyes, respect. "Blood has been spilled on this land, but on this dawn, we choose honor." Jonah Briggs stood frozen in the heart of the Apache circle, the morning sun warming his face. His life had been irrevocably altered. He was no longer just a man haunted by ghosts. He was a man bound by an oath. And it had all started with a simple human choice made in a moment of despair, a bucket of water and a scrap of bread. In the days that followed, the battered homestead became a place of improbable healing. Under the warm autumn sun, the sounds of hammers and saws replaced the crack of gunfire. Apache warriors who had first circled the ranch as a threat now worked alongside Jonah, raising a new barn from the ashes of the old. The four sisters remained their strength, a constant, reassuring presence. Nala, with her quiet authority, directed the rebuilding efforts, her wisdom bridging the gap between two cultures. Taya, whose power had been a weapon of war, now used it to lift heavy beams into place, a silent and tireless architect of renewal. Suri, ever watchful, tended to Jonah's meager garden, her gentle hands coaxing new life from the dry soil. Kiona, her fiery spirit tempered by the ordeal, helped Jonah round up the few remaining cattle. Her laughter a sound the valley had not heard in years. Jonah, in turn, found himself changing. The deep lines of grief around his eyes began to soften. The constant weight on his shoulders seemed to lessen. Working with the Apache, he learned their language, their customs, and their deep connection to the land he had only ever sought to tame. He was no longer just a rancher fighting for survival. He was becoming a part of something larger than himself. One afternoon, as they worked, Suri paused and looked at him, her dark eyes seeming to see straight into his soul. "The soldier with the wolf eyes," she said softly. "He carries the same mark as the fire that took your family." Jonah stopped, his hammer held aloft. "What do you mean?" "I see things," she whispered, her gaze distant. "Connections. A shadow behind him. A wealthy man in a fine suit, a man who wants all this land for his iron horse. The soldier is merely his hunting dog. The fire that took your family. It was not a raid. It was an eviction." The truth of her words hit Jonah with the force of a physical blow. The shell casing, the calculated nature of the attack. It had never been random. A cold, hard fury began to build in his heart, displacing the grief that had lived there for so long. It wasn't just Merrick. It was a conspiracy. That night, Nala approached him as he sat staring into the flames of a communal fire. She held something out to him. It was his wife's silver locket. One of our scouts found it on a captured soldier, she explained. He said Merrick gave it to him as payment. Jonah took it, his fingers closing around the cool metal. He opened it, gazing at the faces of his wife and children. But the memory no longer brought just pain. It now brought a burning need for justice. They didn't just kill my family, he said, his voice low and hard. They tried to erase them, to make it seem as if they never mattered. Nala sat beside him. We all carry wounds, Jonah Briggs. What defines us is whether we let them destroy us or if we turn them into strength. He knew then what he had to do. This wasn't just about his personal revenge anymore. Merrick and his unseen master were a cancer on the land, destroying everyone, white and Apache alike, who stood in their way. They had to be stopped. He was no longer just Jonah Briggs, the grieving widower. He was Nantan Dalke, the keeper of the oath. And he had an oath to keep. The final confrontation was destined for redemption. Jonah learned from Apache scouts that Merrick, having recruited new thugs, had taken control of the town, operating under the guise of maintaining order for a railroad survey team. He was using the town as a base to systematically drive the remaining settlers and Apache from the valley. The railroad baron, a man named Silas Croft, was pulling the strings from the safety of a private rail car miles away. But Merrick was his fist. Jonah and the four sisters rode not for revenge, but for justice. A storm was gathering as they approached the town, and the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that mirrored the fury in Jonah's heart. They wouldn't ride into a trap. Suri, in one of her quiet trances, had seen the place, the old abandoned church on the edge of town. It was there Merrick would be. They entered the church as the first drops of rain began to fall. The air inside was cold and musty, smelling of dust and decay. Light filtered through the grimy stained glass windows, painting the nave in eerie shifting colors. A broken clock on the wall was frozen at midnight. At the far end of the church near the altar, Merrick stood waiting. He was not alone. Two of his men held the town sheriff, a gag in his mouth and a pistol to his head. I knew you'd come. Briggs Merrick's voice echoed in the cavernous space. A man can't let go of his sentiment, can he? It's your greatest weakness. Let him go, Merrick. Jonah said, his rifle held steady. The four sisters fanned out behind him, silent and imposing, as the stone apostles carved into the walls. Merrick chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. You want to know the funny thing? I remember you. From before. I remember this whole valley. Mr. Croft pays well for land cleared of obstacles. The pieces clicked into place, sharp and terrible. Suri was right. That was you, Jonah whispered, the realization sucking the air from his lungs. The fire. It was a beautiful night, Merrick said, his eyes gleaming with a sadistic pleasure. He began to hum a quiet, off-key tune, a simple folk melody. It was the same tune Jonah had heard a group of soldiers singing the day he'd gone to town for supplies, the day his family died. The forgotten memory slammed into him. We were under orders, of course. Official Union business. Subduing hostiles. Your wife? She had spirit. I'll give her that. A roar of pure animalistic rage tore from Jonah's throat. He lunged forward, and all thought of strategy gone, replaced by a singular blinding need to destroy the man who had stolen his world. The church exploded into a symphony of violence. Gunshots boomed like thunderclaps, their flashes illuminating the chaos. Taya moved like a storm, her massive fists clearing a path to the sheriff. Kiona, armed with 2 long knives, became a whirlwind of flashing steel, engaging Merrick's other men. Nala directed them with sharp commands, while Suri seemed to anticipate every move, her quiet presence a deadly anchor in the storm. Jonah saw nothing but Merrick. He tackled the sergeant, sending them both crashing over a splintered pew. They rolled on the dusty floor, fists and elbows flying. Merrick was strong, a seasoned brawler, but Jonah was fueled by 3 years of repressed agony. He fought with the strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. He finally gained the upper hand, his hands closing around Merrick's throat, squeezing the life from him. Merrick's face turned purple, his eyes bulging. This was it, the moment he had dreamed of, the moment of vengeance. "Kill him, Jonah," Kiona screamed, having dispatched her opponents. "For your family." He looked into Merrick's terrified eyes and saw not a monster, but a pathetic, defeated man. He saw the face of the violence that had consumed his own life. If he killed him now in cold blood, what would separate him from this man? He would be perpetuating the very cycle of hatred that had cost him everything. He saw Sarah's face in his mind, her gentle smile. She would not have wanted this. Vengeance would not bring her back. It would only destroy what was left of the man she had loved. With a final ragged cry, Jonah released his grip and slammed Merrick's head against the floorboards, knocking him unconscious. He stood up, trembling, his chest heaving. He had made his choice. Not vengeance. Justice. Just then, as the rain hammered against the roof, Suri spoke, her voice cutting through the silence. "It is as I saw. Their chief Nahema was deceived. The treaty he signed with the railroad man Croft, it was a lie. He thought he was granting passage. Instead, he signed away the rights to the entire valley. The final piece fell into place. Merrick wasn't just clearing land. He was enforcing a fraudulent treaty. The Apache, the settlers, Jonah himself, and they were all victims of the same greedy, invisible hand. As if summoned by the revelation, the great church doors swung open. Chief Nahema stood there, flanked by his warriors, drawn by the sounds of the fight. They took in the scene, the defeated thugs, the rescued sheriff, and Jonah standing over the unconscious form of Merrick. They saw the choice he had made, the mercy he had shown in the face of his family's murderer. The aftermath was swift. With Merrick captured and the sheriff as a witness, the full scope of Silas Croft's conspiracy was exposed. The fraudulent treaty was nullified. Federal marshals, alerted to the crimes that had been committed under the guise of progress, arrested Croft, dismantling his corrupt empire. The town of Redemption, having seen both the savagery of Merrick's gang and the honor of Jonah and his Apache allies, began a slow and painful process of healing its own deep-seated prejudices. Chief Nahema formally declared a lasting peace, not just an alliance of convenience, but a genuine partnership with the settlers, who remained a shared guardianship of the valley they all called home. The sisters, their names cleared and their actions celebrated, returned to their people as heroes. Weeks later, Jonah stood before the 3 small graves under the oak tree. The autumn sun was warm on his face. He held the silver locket in his hand, its surface now polished to a bright gleam. For 3 years, this small object had been an anchor holding him to a past defined by guilt and failure. He had failed to save his family, but in saving the sisters and choosing mercy over revenge, he had finally saved himself. He opened the locket, looking at the tiny, smiling portraits for the last time. He saw not a reminder of his failure, but a memory of the love that had once filled his life, a love that had taught him the value of compassion. With a gentle reverence, he dug a small hole at the foot of the graves and placed the locket inside. He covered it with earth, burying the last remnant of his haunted past. He was no longer just a keeper of a painful memory. He was Nantan Dalke, the keeper of the oath, a man with a future to build. He turned and walked back toward his rebuilt ranch. The new barn stood strong against the horizon, and leaning against the fence waiting for him was Nala. She held a hammer in her hand and gestured toward a section of railing that still needed mending. A new beginning built not on loss, but on mutual respect and a shared promise for a better dawn.